statewide network of sites that are related to the state's history with slavery, abolition, and the 20th century contributions of African Americans. My guests today are two proud and special New Haveners, but definitely two outstanding servant leaders, citizens of the state of Connecticut. First, the Honorable Mayor Toni Nathaniel Harp, the 50th Mayor of New Haven. Mayor Harp has been a community advocate, an alderwoman, a state senator, a dynamic friend, and her most important role, in my opinion, is her role as outstanding mom and grandmother. Mayor Harp, then Senator Harp, introduced the legislation to create the Connecticut Freedom Trail. And our other guest is none other than the man I call the Centennial Man, Alfred Marder, who is the founder and longtime president of the Amistad Committee Incorporated, based in New Haven, and known all over the world. And Mr. Al is also the founder and I call the architect of the Connecticut Freedom Trail. We're going to start today's conversation with you, Mayor Harp. Can you please share with the audience your role in the establishment of the Connecticut Freedom Trail?
Yes, I was a new state senator, and I got a call from Al Marder, who basically said, remember what we did in New Haven to develop the statue of Singe PA on representing the Amistad event. And he said to me, this wasn't the only thing that has happened in New Haven and in Connecticut, and that we should have a Connecticut Freedom Trail, and that it should be something that is done through the state of Connecticut. And now that you're at the Senate, I think that you can help us get that done. And so basically, I had to figure out relatively new how to get a bill passed and to get some resources attached to the bill that would document all of the freedom sites throughout our state. And I was excited to do that. I, at the time, went to Varick Memorial AMEZ Church, and I learned that right there, and nobody would know it, but in the parsonage was a site for the Underground Railroad. And it occurred to me that there are all of these sites all over New Haven and all over Connecticut, and nobody knows about them. And by and large, no one much knew about our history. So what I did was draft a bill, and I asked a number of other people in our delegation, the New Haven delegation, to sign on to that bill, and they were excited to do so. And once I drafted the bill and it went to the Committee of Cognizance, then because it was going to cost money to establish these sites, it went to the Appropriations Committee, and I sat on the Appropriations Committee, and I lobbied hard there for the bill. Then I went to state senator at the time. He was president pro tem of the Senate. He's now Congressman John Larson. And I said to him, this is really important for this state. There's so much history of the people who cooperated with ending slavery and moving towards freedom for all people, as well as the people, my people, who were actually helped through this. And he was excited to be helpful. And that meant a lot because it helped us get things through the various committees. It made sure that once it came to the floor that I had his support, the support of our delegation. Marty Looney was the state senator with me. Bill Dyson was in the House and was very supportive, so that we knew that we had champions that could actually speak to these things. But what you also need are people on the ground who think this is important. And Al Marder led that charge. He made sure that when there were public hearings, that people would come up, that they would speak ardently and really begin to convince everyone that this is something that we should do, not just for a few people in New Haven because I sponsored the bill, but it was something that was critically important for the entire state of Connecticut.
Mayor Harp, Coming up on 30 years of the Connecticut Freedom Trail, is this what you envisioned when you were talking to your colleagues in the legislature?
One of the things that I thought about is that there were numerous places in New Haven that I could mention myself that should be cited, but I had no idea that there were so many other places. And actually, Al Marder brought that to my attention, that there were other places that needed to be named on the trail and that it really wasn't just a New Haven story. And so when there were 50, I was surprised. And now that there are 160 and counting,
Yes.
more to be established, it's really so important that we've done this work and that this story is available for people who want to travel the trail and for young people to understand the importance of Connecticut and the whole idea of freedom in this democracy.
Absolutely. A lot of what you said, Mayor Harp, about what compelled you or what was sort of a guiding force for you as you did the work in the legislature related back to this gentleman we're going to be talking to now, Al Marder, and the importance of having citizens advocating and being in contact with their representatives in government. Mr. Al, what compelled you to see the need for an organization like the Connecticut Freedom Trail?
Thank you, Charles. Excuse me. And it's a pleasure to share this platform with the Mayor Harp.
Absolutely.
To me, the Freedom Trail is at the front line of educating the American people on the struggle against slavery, against racism, against injustice in our country. The Freedom Trail, by its very nature, illuminates this historic 400-year struggle. And I think we have to recognize at the very beginning of our discussion that effort to correct the teaching of our history, the way the country was fashioned, is under severe attack today. I think the background for our discussion today is this vicious attack against the efforts in the school systems nationally to correct the teaching of history, of American history. What we're discussing is American history and the way our country was founded. And you cannot ignore slavery, racism, hangings, etc., in the discussion. And so it's part of this historic effort to correct an understanding of our own history. When I was asked by the two congregational ministers, Reverend Edmonds of Dixville Congregational Church and Peter Ives, Reverend Peter Ives of the First Congregational Church in New Haven, to organize the events for the 150th anniversary of Amistad. I did not appreciate what this would involve and never dreamed that out of that effort, commemorating the 150th anniversary of the Amistad trials, the most important trials in the history of our country in terms of the fight for freedom, that what would come out of it would be a statue a boat, an opera, books galore, and finally a freedom trail that would tell the story of individuals, of Connecticut citizens in their struggle to rectify the tragedy of those years.
Well, Mr. Al, what was it like getting colleagues across the state of Connecticut to join with you to see your vision and to participate?
Well, it was very interesting. When the Amistad, first of all, I must say from the very beginning that Mayor Harp, at that time, Alderwoman Toni Harp, was instrumental in helping to get the Amistad statue erected in front of City Hall. This is a momentous situation because it's the most important event in U.S. history in the struggle against slavery. But the ramifications of that is what brought me to begin to understand the need for a Connecticut Freedom Trail. Because I began to meet with people all over the state who began to tell me stories about what was happening, what happened in their towns. And we're a state of 169 towns, some of them very small. But if you look back into the history, it's out of these small towns that most of the African Americans and were living, not the larger towns. And that's where so much of this took place.
So did you have a captive and willing team with you that helped to develop those initial sites on the trail, or was it hard for you?
Well, first of all, I had the absolute 100% support of the Amistad committee. That's done so much over the last 30 years, 32 years perhaps, to bring the story of the Amistad to the American people, and of course, to try to change the attitudes that exist. And they were 100% for us. But it was a very interesting circumstance. With the dedication of the statue, it was a very, very rainy day. And so most of the plans that we had for outdoor activities were canceled. But we took all the people and we invited them into Center Church and the Green. And Governor Weicker, at that time, addressed the audience. And in his remarks, he said, "White America must know the story of the Amistad." And I sat there in the pew and said to myself, we have an ally in Governor Weicker. After that event, I went back to the Amistad Committee and suggested that there should be a Connecticut Freedom Trail incorporating all the events that have taken place in the Connecticut history in that struggle. I then wrote to Governor Weicker and suggested the Connecticut Freedom Trail. At the same time, we were approached by a small group from New York City that had told me that in 1976, they had rented the Western Union vessel, had placed the name Amistad on it, and sailed in the toll boat event that takes place every 4 years. And that they were anxious to initiate a construction of a replica of the Amistad vessel that would serve as a classroom for young students. So we made an appointment with Governor Weicker, a delegation from various organizations in New Haven and Connecticut to talk about building a boat. And then after that discussion, I asked Governor Weicker about the Freedom Trail. And he said to me, I thought we had decided upon that, and called in his staff and said, what's happening with the Freedom Trail? Well, they assured him that everything was in the works. I must say publicly now that that was not true. Because upon investigation, I found there was nothing done. I was told several weeks later that the Tourist Council of Connecticut met every month, and there was opportunity for public expression at the first 5 minutes of the meeting. I went to Rocky Hill where they met, and I proceeded to wait for the meeting. The meeting started on time, and at that time, the chief of staff of the Tourist Council came in late, and when he heard what I was saying, said, why don't you talk to the people in the Tourist Council? And he told me to go and meet with him. So I walked into the office of the Tourist Bureau and sat down with a woman who said, Al, don't bother with the Tourist Council. Why don't you go right to the General Assembly? And that drove me to speak to Senator Harp.
And do you remember Senator Harp's initial response? I mean, I know she's here, but I want to know if you remember her initial response to.
Of course. First of all, we had a wonderful relationship based upon the Amistad Committee, Amistad Statue and Amistad Committee. I realized early on that since she was not a Connecticut native, like many others, did not know about the Amistad trials. Mm-hmm. And by the way, that was a phenomena that I discovered for several years, even among Connecticut citizens and people, Connecticut political figures. So it was a very pleasant relationship. And it didn't need much convincing a discussion because Mayor Harp understood almost immediately how this would enhance the discussion, the absolutely historic discussion necessary in the struggle against the remnants of slavery, racism, and injustice in our country, etc.
So how, and this question is for both of you, how do we go from the early 90s and the understanding that the contributions of all people should be recognized are important to the national fabric. We understand that then. We have a law created or a bill that establishes something like the Connecticut Freedom Trail. And today we're in a situation where telling these kinds of stories, recognizing these kinds of contributions in this history is something to be outlawed and prevented. How does that happen?
I think that I think that the privilege that is accrued to the people who are, quote, the founders, who are Western European, has been threatened. I think that, in all honesty, once Barack Obama became the president of the United States, that there were some who just saw their influence slipping and felt that this ought to be a country that is based upon racial superiority of some people. And I think it was an idea that was never really had to be dealt with, because there was never any question who was on top in this country. And as that became to be more and more questioned, there was what I would consider to be a reactionary movement of some people who hadn't accepted the premise of the United States of America, which is that all men, and I would say women, are created equal. There are some people who just don't believe that, but they didn't have to say they didn't believe it until they found their power actually slipping. And so that's why we're seeing this backward reactionary movement that we've been seeing over the past few years. And it doesn't help that the next president of the United States supported that and understood how that racism would favor him.
So did you have any, and Mr. Al, I want you to answer, but I have a question, Mayor Harp, before I move on from you. In introducing this in the General Assembly, was this a safeguard?
I didn't really, there were some people who thought that, it wasn't really necessary, that people already knew. But then when you would ask them about things, they didn't know. And so I think that people actually dealt with it far more from an intellectual place rather than an emotional place, that we're seeing people sort of deal with these issues now. And so I got a lot of support across the board, across cities and towns. And I think the fact that Al and the Amistad Committee were working with some of the small towns that he talked about earlier, and they were able to get the support of their representatives and their senators, that, even though it required some talking, I think most people thought that it was the right thing to do. And they were very proud of Connecticut's history.
Absolutely.
I would like to add, I totally
Sure.
agree with Mayor Harp. I just want to bring something to attention. If we go back to 1963 at the marches of Reverend Martin Luther King and look at the marches and the pictures of the marches, while they were very well attended, the number of white participation was pretty much limited. And if you look at who participated, it was mostly ministers and people from the churches, but rather limited. When you look at the marches, the protest marches of George, after the murder of George Floyd, you will see the huge numbers of young white marching and protest. What a vast change in our country. And this frightened those very people, the Trumps Incorporated, with their reactionary outlook, who wanted to break the unity between black and white. And that explains as well this campaign against voting rights and for eliminating any mention of history the way it was fashioned in our country in the school system. I agree totally with what Mayor Harp said about the fears and anxieties, that ignorance has produced. But this is a deliberate attempt to smash any unity between black and white, which is essential in a country like ours, with 13% African Americans, for the unity of black and white if we're going to change the nature of this situation.
Well, you mentioned the protests of George Floyd's, excuse me, the protests surrounding George Floyd's murder. Those protests were largely populated by young people. And the young people in this state have made a dent, a very significant offering by pushing for the inclusion of Black and Latino studies in the state history curriculums. What role do you all see the Connecticut Freedom Trail playing in meeting the needs of young people to learn diverse history?
Well, I think it's really important that young people learn the history, because I really think it's American history. What sets America apart is that we are a country that is built upon ideals and the rule of law. And it's based upon this whole trajectory that we've made in terms of how we define freedom. And, and you really can't define it unless you know the opposite. And we lived in this country the opposite of freedom, and have lived it and have been working on empowering and making people of all types, of all cultures, free, so they can pursue what it is that they want to pursue in their lives and achieve what they want to achieve. That's what makes America special. And the fact that there are some that would want to maintain control and have us lose that is beyond me. But I wanted to point out one thing. There was another time when the government sort of pushed back this whole idea of people coming together, and that was Kent State. And if you think about what happened to education, this is my crazy idea, but what happened to education after Kent State? It was defunded. It was harder and harder for people who didn't have resources to get into colleges. Education now is bankrupting some people because of what they owe. And it's all because there were certain people who looked at, you saw blacks and whites and others together, basically saying to this country that, you have got to listen to us. And so as a result, they tried to push things backwards. So pushing things backward after the Black Lives Matter campaigns isn't the first time that happened. It happened before, and there were severe ramifications to, I believe, our entire country. And the whole idea of freedom based upon what happened with Black Lives Matter, but also what happened previously during the Vietnam War and those protests.
And so,
excuse me.
Go ahead, Mr.
I agree with Mayor, but we're facing this right-wing attack on all levels, and I think it's behooving to us to begin to mobilize again against these attacks. And the Freedom Trail, which plays a very important role, especially for young people, the students. It should be incorporated in the curriculum of our schools. All young people in our schools should know the Amistad story and the struggle for freedom and what that meant for our country. Because unfortunately, the lessons of the Amistad trials were not learned, and it ended up in a civil war.
So we've mentioned the Amistad story as the catalyst and as sort of a uniting topic across the state. But what are some of the other sites that stand out to you, or do you all have a favorite Connecticut Freedom Trail site in the state?
Well, you know, of course, I would say that my favorite is the statue of CPA. You know, it was, and you know, one of the things that people don't realize is that that statute, yes, there was state money and there was some municipal money, but it was really built through contributions of children. So children learned about that site. They went around and they raised money to help pay for that site. And so I think that is the most important one. But I am also going to say, you know, like I grew up in Salt Lake City, Utah, and I didn't know that much. We weren't taught that much about African American history in Utah, except that there was slavery, and you know, and it wasn't taught well. Long story short, but I think that it's really important that people understand what the Underground Railroad was. You know, when I'd gone to college in Chicago and I was reading about the Underground Railroad, and I was relatively young and was trying to wrap my head around it. And it wasn't until I came to New Haven and I actually saw a site of the Underground Railroad that it was really clear to me what this all meant. And so I would say that the site over I would say the Underground Railroad site right adjacent, it's the parsonage of Varick Memorial AMEZ Church, is a real important one to me. And then also where you have the Masons building over on Gulf Street is another one that is really important to me, because that's a place where they wanted to actually build a school for Black children. And part of the history of Connecticut was that the General Assembly didn't allow that to happen. And so, you know, the whole story, it's of Prudence Crandall, of trying to get African-American children educated is an important story that we continue to remember, and especially in light of some of the difficulties that we're having with education today. So that's mine. I'm sorry, Alan.
No, that's a good one. Those are all good. Prudence Crandall House and Museum is one of mine as well. Mr. Al, your favorite sites on the trail or outstanding ones to you?
Well, my favorite site, of course, is the Amistad statue. Because of its ramifications. People don't realize that with the Amistad trials and the victory, that the South was up in arms because they felt that it would encourage the slaves to rebel. And so with the Amistad trials was the first time that white abolitionists joined with Black abolitionists in common struggle. This was absolutely a first, and it was portend the future. So, of course, Prudence Crandall's story, and also one of the important sites, and I think most people are not aware, that in Norwich, Connecticut, was the birth of David Ruggles. And David Ruggles was a young African-American who went to New York and organized a group that would go into the ships to see if they were transporting slaves. And it was in David Ruggles' little store that Frederick Douglass got married. And he is I think, one of the great heroes of Connecticut.
And I love that you shared the Norwich connection with David Ruggles. Again, with having these sites spread out over the state, and like you said, many are in small towns. This rolls me into my next question about how do we share the story of the Connecticut Freedom Trail and then get our citizens to visit these sites associated with the trail.
You know, one of the things that I believe that, and maybe Chazzy, excuse me, Charles,
Okay.
you could answer this more, but you know, I want to tell you a little bit. Somebody asked the question about how long did it take to get the bill passed? Well, the bill passed relatively quickly, and there were resources that were attached to the bill, and some of those resources, I believe, actually came down to New Haven. But over time, you know, like the thing about certain bills is that you think that they continued to be passed and everything remained static. Well, that it doesn't necessarily happen that way. And so what happened, you know, like time after time, I would hear from Al that there would be a problem and that we had to rescue it because either the resources were being taken away or they were getting rid of the whole initiative through the department that it was in. And so that there was a continual, you had to be vigilant continually to make sure that this continued. And I think ultimately it got absorbed into, I believe, the tourism mechanism for the state. And so at least while I was in the legislature and paying much more attention to it, there was an effort to make sure that people knew where the sites were. Certainly the sites are all marked, and that it was part of our overall tourism initiative to promote this. And that's what I recall. But, you know, like it requires, and that's what I believe why we have the committee, it requires constant vigilance to make sure that you get adequate funding, that you get adequate airtime in terms of getting the resources to promote the trail. All of these things are important, and it requires constant work.
And I must say, Mayor Harp, that the State Historic Preservation Office has done a yeoman's job with making sure that we're adding new sites and that we are on the lookout for opportunities to share stories about the Connecticut Freedom Trail. And a person I didn't mention yet, Todd Levine, who has been a longtime coordinator for the Freedom Trail through the State Historic Preservation Office, has been in step with me, taking up the mantle from where Mr. Al left off. So the State Historic Preservation Office is tending to the Freedom Trail.
Phenomenal.
Here, here. I agree with that.
Yes, absolutely. Mr. Al, I have a question for you. You know, I call you the Centennial Man. I hope you don't mind me sharing, but you are 100 years old. And in that 100 years, at the beginning, you started out as a young student activist, and one of your colleagues and comrades in the work was a young lady who you referred to, you know, in a very calm way as Connie. And I'm talking about the great Constance Baker Motley. Can you share a bit about the force that was Judge Motley?
Oh, I'd love to. I was a junior at Hill House. And we had organized the New Haven Youth Council, and representatives of a number of the organizations and the churches came together to discuss what we can do during this oppression for young people in our state. Jobs, scholarships, recreation, etc. And one of the members representing St. Luke's was Constance Baker. And this Constance Baker, we recognized from the very beginning, was an exceptional student and a leader. And we began to organize, asking for scholarships for young black students to UConn. We organized for jobs for young people at that point. And we also organized for athletics and facilities for young people. And Constance Baker Motley was a contributor, very capable, articulate contributor to that effort. And so she became a member of our group, and we consider her an important leader. And when we heard that the engineer C.W. Blakesley had agreed to sponsor Connie Baker's education, we were destroyed. We actually thought that he was buying off this voice. And instead of, congratulating her, we felt that she was stolen from our ranks.
Got it.
Well, now I must tell you something that perhaps you're not aware of. In 1966, when President Johnson appointed Constance Baker Motley to the federal court, the Senate, the U.S. Senate, held a committee hearing and subpoenaed all of us who have been members of the Youth Council.
Wow.
to come to Washington. And their aim was to prove that the Youth Council was a communist plot and that Constance Baker Motley was a communist. I was subpoenaed, and I was represented by that very well-known woman attorney, Catherine Rohrbach. And, of course, the nomination went through. But this was typical of the Senate and the right wing of that time to stop the appointment of a Constance Baker Motley.
Well, I'm proud to say, Mr. Al, that Constance Baker Motley's summer home in Chester was recently added to the Connecticut Freedom Trail as one of our newer sites. And that summer home, and then there's an adjacent plot of land where there's a walking trail called the Little Rock 9 walking trail. Those folks are full of verve and energy and are representing all of Judge Motley's hard work and what she stands for. They're representing very well. And that's one of our newer Freedom Trail sites.
Do you think it's
Mayor
important
Harp,
for people to remember that she worked on the case of Brown versus Board of Education, and
Yes.
that our education system and the whole idea of separate but equal went away because of her hard work? I think it's really important. It changed education for people of color across this country.
Charles, I totally agree. And I hope that we erect a statue to Constance Baker Motley and that we put it as close to Hill House as we can.
That is a
How,
good idea. And Charles, you know what? That is going to be on you. You've been directed to get that done.
well, thank you very much. I have a question from the chat. There's a teacher who wanted to know how they can use in an interdisciplinary way the resources of the Connecticut Freedom Trail with teaching in their classrooms.
You know, I think that one of the things that can happen is that they actually take the young people out to the various sites and let them see what those sites are, and then connect that to how it's moved the whole idea of freedom forward in our country for everyone. Because, you know, actually the freedom of my ancestors, the African slaves, actually led to freedom for other people and other ethnic groups across our country. And so to be able to connect that, and to be able to connect that with the whole concept of democracy and what that means and how vital it is that everyone participates in it, while it is something that can link backward, it's also contemporary. And if they can walk and touch these sites, then they know that they too can be part of making sure that this country lives up to its ideals, because we are, as I said before, a country of ideals and a country of laws.
Hear, hear.
Mr. Al, got a question for you. You got a memory like a steel trap. Do you remember some of the first Freedom Trail sites, the first official ones?
Yes. Was in Farmington, Connecticut. People don't realize that small town was a center for Amistad activity.
Right.
And had located every house and every location that was touched. After the trial, they had brought the Amistad captives to Farmington and then raised money to send them back to Sierra Leone. And they had meticulously organized. So this was the foundation of the Connecticut Freedom Trail.
Wow. Another question is, what would you all like to see the Freedom Trail evolve into?
You know, I'm hoping that people from around the country, and really, frankly, from around the world, will come to Connecticut and march through the sites of the Freedom Trail, that they'll spend at least 5 days here in our various towns, getting to know the towns and getting to know the history of these towns, so that they can take it back to wherever they are and have it light the whole torch of freedom for them. So that's what I would like to see happen.
Hear, hear. I agree.
No, it's a wonderful opportunity, honestly, and I think that's a beautiful thing that you two have done, whether you knew it or not. You all created a model for other states and other places to follow, to be able to tell the story. And like you said, it's not just a Black history. This is the story of us as Americans, as citizens of the state of Connecticut. And certainly the Amistad incident, it tells the story of what happens when the best of all people come together to do good. And I think that's something that we can all be proud of, certainly in New Haven, but definitely across the state of Connecticut, because the Amistad story really is a Connecticut story. And I appreciate you two for your efforts and for giving always to make sure that we had it and that we continue to have it. If you have any words for young people who are listening, what would your words for young people be? Mayor Harp first, and then Mr. Al.
Well, I would say that the idea of the United States of America, of all people coming together to reach their highest potential and their highest goals, to be considered free to do that, to participate in their own governing, is an idea worth fighting for. It's under attack. And I would say that we need to band together to make sure that this idea of a democracy that recognizes all people, no matter your color, no matter your language, no matter your disability, no matter your sexual orientation, is an idea worth fighting for.
Thank you.
And
Mr.
for
Al?
me, for young people, I don't regret one day of my life. As a 14-year-old boy, I entered into this struggle, and I think this is a wonderful school for young people to get involved, to protest, to demand, to organize. This is our country, and the young people should take control and continue their activity. It's a wonderful way to lead a very active life.
And those are very powerful words. And I hope the wonderful thing about this program is it will be saved for YouTube viewers to be able to go back and watch this video, for you all to share it with your friends and with people all over so they can learn. This is a wonderful opportunity, being able to hear in your own words the work that you two have done. And it's a privilege for me. Is there anything, recently the Amistad Committee with the city of New Haven, and much to the work of Mayor Harp, got the statue of William Lanson built in New Haven. And that was an unknown story that really deserved light. And once the light was shed on that story, it took off. Are there any other stories in the state that you all would like to tell?
Well, I hope that the Freedom Trail agrees with us and erects a statue for Constance Baker, who became the leader. If she were not a woman, we would have known her name long ago.
And Mayor Harp, over the years, you've had the opportunity to interact with Judge Motley. Was there anything ever direct or indirect that she gave to you?
I've got to say that I was only able to meet her once, and I just knew about her life, and I was in awe and inspired by her. And I think that it's really important that we make sure that there is that statue, and it would be great if it was close to Hill House, so that we don't forget her contribution, because it was extraordinary. And she came from New Haven.
Mm-hmm. No, it's good. It's wonderful. And you're right. It's definitely, she's a national figure, a national treasure who should be honored and recognized in her home state. I really appreciate you all taking the time to be with us today to share the stories of how the Connecticut Freedom Trail was created. It's beautiful when you have the people who were there to do the work tell the story in their own words. So I also want to thank Tammy Denease and the entire team from the Connecticut Democracy Center and Old State House. I'd like to thank certainly Sally for all of her hard work and her leadership, Todd Levine, Liz Shapiro from the State Historic Preservation Office, and all the viewers for tuning in today. What I'd like to share is that you will have an opportunity every month to come back on a Tuesday at noon and hear stories related to the Connecticut Freedom Trail. We have 160 sites and growing, so we have many more stories to tell. And I hope that all the viewers will take the opportunity to listen and share. Thank you for being with us today as we heard the insight and the history from the godmother of the Connecticut Freedom Trail and the architect of the Connecticut Freedom Trail, Mayor Toni Nathaniel Harp, and the Centennial Man, Mr. Alfred Marder. We thank you for being with us. Tammy?
Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Mayor Harp, and thank you, Mr. Alfred Marder, for a wonderful conversation and giving us the backdrop of this most important Freedom Trail. Thank you all. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. As Charles said, each month there is a conversation at noon on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. It's usually the fourth Tuesday of every month. Next month, for March 22nd, it will be Sarah Magoo, a child of the Amistad. And then April 26th will be Little Liberia in Bridgeport with Maisa Tisdale. Thank you again, everyone, for joining. And also, if you are interested in being a judge for History Day, please go to historydayct.org because we are still in need of those judges, and we would appreciate your time. Again, thank you all so very much for tuning in, and until next time.